Hi guys. You should have a blank copy of what says Cornell Notes in the top left-hand corner. You'll use these whenever you do these videos, and in this one it's going to be a little bit longer of a video because I'm going to show you briefly how to fill out at least the main notes section as you do this video. So have this with you as we go. So this lecture is on the earliest Kansas Americans, I guess I should say, but also a little bit about how the Native Americans got here in the first place, and then a little bit at the end just kind of about the lifestyle of the historic tribes in Kansas. So at the very top of your page, you'll see something that says, your name. So you put your name. That's easy. Put your class. Let's say first hour. Or social studies. The date. The topic was the earliest Americans. So you write that in for the topic. And of course, as always, the essential question is important to put there, what we're trying to figure out, which is how did the first people get to North America? And go back to look. And how did the Native Americans of the Great Plains live? So you know that this essential question is what you're focusing on with the notes, and you should be able to answer that in the summary portion at the end of this based on your notes. So don't worry about the questions, main ideas. We're going to focus on this portion that just says notes to start with. So let's get into that. Okay. From what archaeologists and historians tell us, there are a variety of ways that people might have first gotten here. The first way, and it's the most accepted way by archaeologists, is the land bridge theory. So tens of thousands of years ago, we were in a time of an ice age. There was a lot more land exposed because the ocean levels were lower. It was all frozen in ice. And that exposed, connected essentially, the area between what we would say Russia today and Alaska. And what they believe is they came across where this red line on this map is, down into North America, Central America, and South America. And you've probably learned about some of those ancient civilizations, the Inca, the Maya, the Aztec that developed, but also just the Native American cultures in North America. There are a couple other ways they say that they traveled. By boat down the western coast with that blue line, but some even say that they came from other places. These people that came here, of course, would have been following large animals. They were big game hunters, like woolly mammoths. But some people even argue that people from Africa took boats to the Americas, and they claim that because of these statues that are in Central America, these large, giant statues, taller than people. And the way their features are laid out, a lot of people, archaeologists, say that they look as if they are African in descent, these statues. So there's a lot of theories, but like I said, the most accepted one is the land bridge theory. So if we come back out of our notes here, and we go to our notes, we can type down a few things. So if I'm doing a main heading, I'm going to use the heading that's available to me, which is that, the land bridge and other theories. It's usually at the top of these, so don't worry about missing that. And then I just type in some of the things that, not only on the screen, but maybe also that I said in the lecture. So, for example, there was an ice age, and caused more land to be open. And we could say hunters from Asia crossed bridge to North America. You can put some of the other ones if you want, but I think that's probably the most important ones to include. So let's move on. So in Kansas history, we're going to be talking about the Great Plains Native Americans, and that's kind of on this map here, this light green shaded area, and you'll see that Kansas fits right there in the middle. Also, when I talk about the Kansas Native Americans, do keep in mind there was no such thing as Kansas at this time. Kansas is a government-created entity with, for the most part, invisible lines except for the northeast corner, which is the Missouri River. There was no Kansas, there was no Nebraska, Oklahoma, Missouri, any of that. Thousands and thousands and thousands of years ago. But these tribes lived there on the land that we still know as the Great Plains. That's what I mean when I refer to that. So, what do we know about the first early Native Americans? Well, the only thing that we do know is what was left behind by them in artifacts. We know that, for the most part, they were hunter-gatherers. It's not until later that they settled down, and we'll talk about that. We know that through the radioactive dating of the things that are found at some of the sites, that they interact with other cultures, and we know this because we find pottery and decorative jewelry that came from the East Coast. That there's only one way that could have gotten here, and that's through trade. And they traded this new technology, and they developed over time even some of their abilities to hunt. For example, many of the tribes in the Great Plains use what was called an atlatl, which is this device right here. And that item was a kind of a primitive bow and arrow. You got one giant arrow and a little pole that you're throwing it with. But they, through trade and interaction, got the bow and arrow from other tribes. And as time went on, they were able to kind of develop and their population grew. All right, so let's go back to our notes and see what we could have added. Come back to our notes. The next section would have been the early Kansas Native Americans. And again, I just used the headings from the presentation. And so I actually am abbreviating some of the notes from what I said and what's on there. So I said that we only know about them from oral traditions and artifacts. So it's what they passed on. And they traded for new technology, which, like such as bow and the arrow, pottery, and this allowed them to grow population. So there were no photographs, there were no written records of this. What we do have, though, in the archaeological timeline is that about 800 years ago, archaeologists found that the tribes in the Great Plains and in Kansas, some of them began settling down. What they found were areas of indentions in the land where there were 10 to 20 of these in an area, and they found these circular indentions, and around it there were essentially like shadows where wood had broken down over time, little post holes kind of that showed that they clearly were making a circular image, and so these would have been the first huts that would have been permanent villages. And in these villages there were artifacts left behind, such as farming tools. You see here in this little animation this Native American with what we would consider a backhoe here, and it's got a scapula bone on it that they would have used instead of metal. They didn't have metal before Europeans. they would have found things like this. This is called a threading needle or weaving needle, and these tribes that built these structures, if they used grass, they would use this needle to tie down and weave through the grass. You have that sharper point that would go through and allow, it was kind of like threading. And they also found food storage pits where they found evidence of carbon from food that had been stored in these dugout pits underground to preserve it or hold it for periods of time. When I say historic tribes, I am talking about the first tribes we know of when written record comes into play. And written record comes into play the first time with a man, Francisco de Coronado, who was a Spanish conquistador or an explorer who was coming through parts of what we now know the United States, including Kansas, searching for gold and other resources. When the Spanish came, they introduced the Great Plains Native Americans to horses, which drastically changed their culture. And we learned for the first time just how important the buffalo was to the tribes of the Great Plains. Coronado described them as furry cows and talked about how the Native Americans' life depended upon that animal. And we know this from the hide paintings that we found that depict how just important the buffalo were. So last part here, just kind of a breakdown of the different tribes that we'll refer to. Typically we talk to them as sedentary and nomadic tribes. The sedentary tribes, the historic tribes in Kansas that we know of, were the Wichita, the Pawnee, the Kansa, and the Osage. These sedentary tribes lived in permanent villages, meaning they didn't move, they stayed there as long as they could. And they were houses that were built out of grass, like for example, we have an example of a Wichita house here. It's a grass-based home with a little beehive. They were built out of earth, very similar to the Wichita, but then covered with earth. This would have been the Pawnee, and also homes of bark. These Native Americans typically grew the same things: corn, pumpkin, squash, and beans. Specifically, the three here that I have this picture, which they called the Three Sisters. They grew these three things because they grew well together and helped each other grow, and kept the ground nourished. So they lived off of that land. They also hunted buffalo, but they did have permanent villages. The other tribes, the nomadic tribes, were the Cheyenne, the Arapaho, the Kiowa Apache, and the Comanche. And they followed their food source, which was, of course, specifically the buffalo, but also deer and other wild animals, but absolutely buffalo. And they lived in teepees, which is the traditional thing that comes to mind when we think of Native Americans, but it fit their culture because the teepees were easy to set up and take down and to quickly move to get to the food sources they needed to. So they hunted and gathered and also traded for some food. In order to move, they used these items called travoises. Originally would have been attached to dogs, but then later on, after the Spanish introduced the horses, to horses so that they could move their items. There was some trade and interaction between these different culture groups, these Native Americans. For the most part positive, but they did fight over land disputes. They didn't have the same kind of rigid land policies that we do today, but they did get into conflict with that. Most interaction, though, was good. The horse allowed for greater interaction between all the groups, and nomadic tribes would trade buffalo meat and buffalo hides, to the sedentary tribes for some of those garden vegetables that they grew. And for the most part, they lived in peace, but there were times of violence between them over land and resources and hunting grounds. That's it. So make sure that you got the notes section filled out, and then later on we'll go over the questions.